Good evening. Just out of curiosity, how many are here just tonight at the Novena? Okay. How many people were here last night? Okay. Thank you for coming back. You may remember last night that we talked about some of these universal experiences we all have in suffering, and that loss of relationships is one of them. Death of a loved one and illnesses are two others. We talked about some of that last night. And when you come back tonight, we pick up the subject of what happens when illness isn't cured, or when the injury doesn't heal, short-term or long-term. Our gospel reminds us very, very clearly today that while the rich may enjoy longer lives, and the rich may have the luxury of being a bit older before we experience serious loss of a loved one in family or friends, certainly much later than people in violent or poor nations do, the wealthy don't have any lower rate of mortality than anyone else. We all have the same rate of mortality, 100%. It's a question of when, not of whether. And the longer we live, rich or poor, it seems, the more losses we experience as we go through life, and the deeper those losses get, whether it's that innocent child's first experience of death with perhaps a pet or an animal that's been living in the backyard and has to learn that difficult lesson, or perhaps, even at a young age, the death of a loved one, grandparents. And by the time we get to old age, if God gives us that gift, I think of so many people who have lost all their parents and grandparents and siblings and even many of their friends, and know that loneliness which only the elderly can know, and have learned to place their trust in God as only the elderly can. And these ways of grieving we have are all kind of connected to each other. I wish it were so simple that when I had this loss in my life, I would grieve that for 2 weeks and it'd be over and then done, and then I have another loss, and now I'll grieve that over here. It just doesn't work that way, does it? Grief kind of weaves a web as we get older. And each major loss that is, anytime we have another major loss, it tugs at that web and it kind of reminds us of the other ones. And if we don't grieve well as we go along, that web can become very, very sticky and very, very confining to us as we try to move forward with our lives. And I was thinking that there are 3 different basic ways that I think at least I've learned to grieve in my life thus far. One is when you lose someone dear, there are patterns in your life that change. And you have to build new patterns around it. That's kind of how we grieve and move on. Then there are those other kinds of grief in which we had a hope for something that never came to be, and through this person's death, we know that in this life anyway, it won't with that person. It's over. What should have been, that now we know will not be. And then that third kind of grief, when we've been so blessed by a person and then they're not in our life and we miss all those good qualities. And we learn to grieve that in a different way. And I'd like to look at these 3 ways of grieving and talk about each in turn. The pattern of changing the way you live because of the loss of someone. When I was very young, my family lived in Alton, and my mom and dad moved down here in 1955 with a couple of kids from central Wisconsin. July and August in St. Louis are not like July and August in central Wisconsin, This year's pretty good. It's a lot better than last year was so far. But one of the ways we dealt with that and kept connected with folks was every year in the summer we'd go stay in my grandfather's great big house in New Lisbon, Wisconsin, near the Dells. And we spent a few weeks visiting with cousins and going to the farm and playing and having a grand old time in much cooler temperatures. And when my grandfather died at the age of 11, that was certainly a loss in its own right in all three of these areas. But one thing I'd like to highlight is that all of a sudden, our vacations couldn't be the way they were because the house was no longer his and where we stayed changed. And so we learned a new reality. My aunt, my mom's sister, who had become a widow just around that same time, a couple years before, she joined us at vacation time, and we would do traveling vacations. So even though we missed Grandpa Fleming in those times of playing on the farms, we also found other new things to do. It didn't mean we didn't grieve or feel the loss, but we found a new way to be. That's a simple example. I think of, as I referred to before, someone who spent 40, 50 years married and loses their spouse, and all the patterns of life that must change. Sharing the same bed every night for all those years, cooking for one, looking after the house, all the different things that people deal with that used to be shared, and now every aspect of life is changed. You used to relate as a couple, and now it's as a single person. People relate to you differently. You find over time new ways of supporting one another or finding different ways of support. And just as in anyone who grieves, you must express your grief in a way that's helpful to you, but also challenge yourself to find a new pattern of living and heal to that new reality. It won't be the same as before. It can't be the same as before. And that doesn't mean that you haven't healed. It just means that perhaps God is going to allow you to be blessed in a new and different way if you allow yourself that opportunity. I think of this second way of grieving when we lose a dream or perhaps an expectation, something we deeply wanted in a relationship with a person that because of their death it cannot be. Perhaps one of the hardest griefs to name, it seems to me, is when a couple lose a child at childbirth or through miscarriage. Because you can't name the what that you're letting go of. You never saw the color of the eyes. You never heard the sound of this child's laughter. Or how they would respond, whether they said mama or dada first, There's this kind of hope and dream that you have to let go of and trust that you might have another way of building that. And the advice, well, you're young, you can always try again. It may be true, it may not be true, but this again will not happen again. There may be other new blessings. There may be other new and wonderful, beautiful children come into your life. Just the other night, Father Allen and I were sitting here during the rosary portion after the Novena, and it was the rainy night when we couldn't go process outside. And we sat over here, and right in front of us there was a young family with 4 beautiful kids. And the youngest was still a baby it was a little girl. They were both little girls in her mom's lap. And she had a sister who might have been about 4 who was playing with her. And we were doing the sorrowful mysteries up here were being read at the lectern. And in front of me, I just saw one of the most joyful mysteries I could ever imagine, these little 2 kids playing and having a grand, wonderful, laughing time together. Even for those of us who do not have children and will not have children, we also have the grace of being able to support and notice and bless those who do in the ways we can and contribute to that next generation. I think of people who have had long relationships which weren't as joyful as they could have been. Perhaps they were even very painful in families. We know that this happens as well, and not every grief is because we miss the wonderful qualities of a person. Perhaps there's something we said that we regret deeply and we wish we could take back in the past. Perhaps there's something they did to us that never really got addressed or healed the way it could or should have been. We can't address that in quite the same way. We can't. And in this life, perhaps it helps us to remember that whether that was broken by addictions or personal limitations on either side, or of simply unreasonable expectations. Maybe we wanted this one person to take care of us and do everything right all the time. Well, how many of you do that? Everything right perfectly all the time? Great. Okay, then this is a wonderful congregation. Okay. None of us does that. And we can't expect that we have that in our life from everyone. No single person can fulfill everything we would like them to be able to do, and nor can we. And it's helpful for me to remember that there is only one perfect one in this creation, and that perfect one is God. And I need to say a word about perfect. As a perfectionist, I'm qualified to do this, okay? Perfect doesn't mean what we often think it means when we refer to God's command, be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. God's perfection, when Matthew uses that phrase, be perfect, when Jesus uses it at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, it's in summary of a whole list of teachings on how to be compassionate. And it says, so therefore, meaning in summary, be perfect as God is perfect. And when the other evangelist, Luke's Beatitudes, has that, or Luke's Sermon on the Plain, rather, Luke uses the term compassionate. Be compassionate as your heavenly Father is compassionate. No one in this life gets everything right all the time, but we can put ourselves in the hands of the one who is perfect, and that means compassionate, and teach ourselves to be compassionate with each other and with those who have passed on as well. We can forgive ourselves and them. We can forgive each other even in death. And as I said, sometimes it's just unreasonable expectations. One of the great holy writers of our day wrote, "You can't always get what you want, but if you try sometimes, you just might find you get what you need." Okay? You weren't expecting the Rolling Stones to make it into the canon today, were you? No. But even the Rolling Stones can get that, so certainly we should. You know, even if it's a good thing, we don't always get what we want, but we often, with God's grace, we do get what we need. And there is no situation who is beyond hope. The ways in which we grieve these unmet needs or expectations are to hope and trust in God's love for us that it will still come to be. And hope, it's not just a wishful thinking, oh gee, I hope the milk's on sale this week. You know, that's not what I'm talking about when I say hope. It's confident expectation from our own experience in life that God will continue to bless and sustain us. The book of Hebrews in the New Testament, which is even more authoritative than the Rolling Stones, I might add, describes hope as an anchor of the soul, sure and firm, which reaches into the interior behind the veil, where Jesus has entered on our behalf as forerunner. We do not only merely recognize that we don't always get what we want, but we hope in God's love and trust that what has been unmet so far in our relationship with these loved ones will, in God's way and in God's time, be met. Perhaps in our lifetime through someone or something else, and perhaps in the next life with that person, if it be God's will and not ours. The third way of grieving we notice when we miss deeply things about the loved one that now are no longer there. And it might be the silliest things, you know. After my mom died, one of the things I picked up, feeding the birds. Lots of people feed birds. It wasn't unique to her. But in front of my office, in front of my bedroom window, there are so many piles of black oil sunflower seed kernels. You know, the way a person spoke, the way they laughed, it's often these subtle, intangible things that can mean so much to us. Or it might even be powerful things, you know, how am I going to support myself? There are often tremendous, very practical losses we face. And one of the things I think is important that we acknowledge in order to be able to grieve this kind of a loss is that this kind of a grief is always wrapped around a sacred core of blessing. There is something about this someone that touched you in a way that no one else ever can or ever will. And yes, that loss is real, but it's real only because the blessing was real. And if as we move through life we can and should and must acknowledge our very real losses and grief, as Christians, we can and should and must also recognize our very real gratitude and blessings for what these people have and continue to mean to us. We can, as Christians, we must continue to have that hope in God who has and will continue to bless us, whether in this life or in the next. And we continue to trust that God will help us find new patterns for those ways that we miss when someone has gone before us. I'm reminded of another contemporary song, at least my age contemporary, okay? You won't hear it on heavy rock radio. It's a Leonard Cohen song. I have to admit, I don't particularly like the song, but there's a wonderful line in the refrain. There's a portion of the verses I like too, but the refrain, I think, is very powerful. And it speaks to us on how we as Christians, I believe, can approach grief in a healthy way. And think of the three ways I mentioned. Making new patterns with what still exists, recognizing the brokenness, asking forgiveness, and living in hope, and recognizing also that we are blessed. The refrain goes, don't worry, I won't sing it. Okay. Ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. How often is it that when we are feeling our most cracked, our most fractured, our most broken, is not that often the condition we are when we most powerfully notice God's light? Isn't that when we most strongly appreciate God's comfort and most strongly voice our hope? We are reminded that we are a chosen and yet a broken people, not the perfect society of days long ago. We are a blessed but a fractured world in need of mending. And as the preface for death mentions, well, I should know this. For the faithful, life is changed, not ended. For the faithful, life is changed, not ended. Earthly life may end in death, but it is not our final destiny. Our final destiny is something greater than we can imagine. Whatever our next world, our next life looks like, whatever words we use to describe it, even the opening hymn we sang, sing with all the saints in glory, sing the resurrection song, and it goes on to describe a bit of heaven. Think of how limited our language is to speak of the next world. I think of the example of twins in utero, unborn twins in the womb. All they know is their physical experience. They have no spoken language such as we have. It's all darkness in there. Their senses are limited to maybe temperature and in this wonderful bath of liquid. They don't taste anything, I guess. All the nourishment and oxygen comes from the placenta and the blood. Sometimes I wonder if they get upset when their mother eats steamed broccoli, but ooh, no. But that's what they know, and perhaps they can also sense someone else there with them and a shrinking world. Are they getting bigger? They don't know. Is the world around them getting smaller? They don't know. There's less movement there's less room than there used to be. What could they possibly share with one another about the world which you and I live today? Color, emotion, food, architecture, music, driving. What could they possibly share? When we speak of the next world, we're kind of like those twins in utero. We know that we're kept well. And perhaps the best we can do is trust that the one who keeps us well will continue to do so when we're beyond what we know. That's hope. That's healing when we've lost someone we love, and know that someday we will take that step ourselves because, as we said, the death ratio is 100%. The ages may change, but the ratio is the same. The ritual we will use tonight uses incense, which is frequently also used in our funeral rites. And we think of Psalm 141, which talks about our prayers rising up like incense before God, carrying that which is wordless. I mean, how often have you tried to grieve and not had the words to grieve? Sometimes we use symbols, visual things, actions. And tonight, as we do this ritual, we will come up as we do for communion. And as you come up, you're praying for those who have gone before you in faith that you wish to remember. Think of the different ways you grieve these people. And as you come up to the front, unite your prayer with a little grain of incense and take it and put it in the common bowl. And that incense will be used tonight when we bring up the gifts. There's several different places to do this, and all that incense will be combined in the same place. It'll be used in our procession for the rosary, and it will be used at the shrine throughout the coming months as we continue to use that incense here. And your prayers will be remembered every time we use that incense for the next months in our own liturgies here. Whether we come forward in sorrow or faith or hope or gratitude, until we are united with that great multitude, let us remember those who have gone before us, marked with a sign of faith, and unite ourselves with that great cloud of witnesses, including those whom we pray to every night here. Joseph, Teresa the Little Flower, St. Eugene de Mazenod, in our Novena to Our Lady of the Snows, and of course to Mary, the Mother of God herself.